What's up everyone? For today's video I'm going to teach you how to create a natural looking nightscape using a Twilight photo and a Milky Way photo. Now the reason why I'm doing this is because I'm trying to create an image with less noise and more sharpness. So I took a Twilight photo at f5 ISO 400, which really gave me more depth of field and a lot less noise. And then I took a picture of the night sky later on. Now I'm also doing this because on the first night in Mono Lake I got skunked with clouds in the sky, but then on my second night I had nice clear skies, but I also had new locations planned out, so I didn't want to come back to the same spots and retake all those pictures. So that's another benefit of learning how to blend two images in case you had a bad night. Now I'm going to show you something that I usually see among other night photographers that are trying to blend a twilight photo with a night photo, and a lot of times it's something like this. They overexpose the foreground and there's no light fall off in the back area of the foreground, so it just looks really unnatural and photoshopped, and that's one thing you want to avoid when doing this type of technique. So I'm going to show you how I naturally blend two images to create a clean looking nightscape. Alright guys, so let's just jump right into the editing process. So I'm going to first start with my twilight picture, and you can see it's underexposed and very blue. So I'm going to increase my exposure, and I'm going to just go up to a stop. You don't want to go too far. You want to keep it as subtle and soft of a light as possible. So this is a good starting point. Next, we're going to warm this up. Right there. Now some people like it cooler. That's pretty much personal preference, but I'm trying to get this rock formation to just look as neutral as possible. I don't want it to be too blue. Alright. And you want to make sure you still have a decent amount of light fall out here. This should be almost black in the background. So I'm actually going to lower my highlights. And I'll increase my shadows a little bit. I'm going to bring in this oval tool and kind of just use that to focus on the tufa right in the foreground here. Increase my shadows and the exposure just a little bit more. I'll also increase the clarity. They're rocks. I don't need to mess with the saturation on these too much, so we could leave that alone. Go down the sharpening. I typically go to around 60. It all depends on the image. So that's pretty good. And since I was underexposed, and I had to raise the exposure, I did bring in some noise, so I'll put some noise reduction on it, but nothing too crazy. It's really not that bad. So I'll just go up to like 10. Yeah, it looks really clean. And I'm at 3:1, so at 1:1 it looks even better. Alright, so that's pretty good right there. Next I'm going to jump over to the Milky Way. Now my Milky Way picture is just a single photo. It was taken at f2.8, 13 seconds, 14 millimeters, and ISO 5000. You can see it's a little bit kind of like green, and I think that's just from the air glow, but a little bit on the warm side. So we're going to cool this down. I don't want it to be blue. I want my blacks to be like a true black. Some people like to make their astrophotography very cool, and again, that's just kind of a personal preference thing. So I'm going to stay right around this range. I think it's just looking a little more on the green side. Like I said, there's a decent amount of air glow in here. We'll increase the vibrance. and the saturation. I'm also going to increase exposure a little bit. And my contrast. I'm going to bring up the whites. And I might do a S-curve, but I'm probably going to save that for Photoshop instead of doing it in Lightroom. Now if we go down to luminance, we could kind of make this, the core, pop a little bit more. If we play around with the orange and the yellow luminance. So I'm going to bring those up a little bit. I'll increase my sharpening to around 50. And we'll put some noise reduction on. Looks pretty good. And I'm going to do some more dodging and burning in Photoshop, so I'm not going to go super crazy with my Lightroom edits on the Milky Way here. But that looks pretty darn good. So let's select the two images that we want to combine. Go to Edit in, Open as Layers in Photoshop. Alright, so now we have our two images in Photoshop, and the first thing I like to do is make a copy. So you just drag it right here to duplicate the layers. Click on your top layer, which is your foreground layer, and we're going to paint away the sky so we can reveal the Milky Way underneath. Now before I do that, I kind of want to separate the sky from the foreground a little bit more, just to kind of make the masking a little bit easier. And there's a couple different ways we could do that. The first thing I want to do is just zoom in, and I'm going to take my burn tool, my burn brush right here, and see these mountains are very similar to the clouds. They're pretty much like the same color blue. That's going to have give it a hard time to separate the foreground and the sky. So I'm going to actually try to burn this and darken it a little bit more. And plus I want to make it dark because I want it to look more realistic. So let's make this a little bit smaller. And this is going to be a little bit tedious work, but it'll be totally worth it, and actually make blending look more realistic and natural. So this should almost be black back here, not really blue. I'm even going to burn the edges of the rocks a little bit. This will kind of help make some separation. I'm going to increase the hardness just to kind of give me a little bit more of an edge. That'll also make separation go a little bit smoother. Okay, if I want more separation, I could actually switch this over to a dodge tool and keep it on lighten, or I'm sorry, highlights, and same thing, just go along the edge of the sky now. And I'm going to increase the exposure. See if that helps me a little bit more. You could also try midtones if highlights isn't picking up enough of the light. This will make life so much easier for us when we go to mask it out. There'll be less work by doing this upfront work right now. Alright, hopefully that should help us out a little bit. So next we want to create our layer mask. Switch to your brush and increase the size. Put your hardness on 100. Increase the size pretty big just to kind of get rid of this, all this sky right here. And as you get closer to your foreground, you could shrink the brush. So you want to get as close as possible to your foreground, and if you happen to hit something and accidentally kind of go too far into it like this, just switch this back to white and you could paint it back. It doesn't have to be perfect, so don't sweat it. Just get really close. You also use your bracket keys to increase and decrease the size of your brush if you don't want to keep on clicking up here. Okay, so that's pretty good right now. Next, I'm going to right click and go to select and mask. Now you could kind of leave your settings as is and then see where that where that puts you when you go start painting over this, or you could experiment and try the settings I have here. I'm going to start off with 2 pixels for my radius, and I'm going to have the contrast at 25. Feather, I can lower that, and I like to shift the edge into the negative, and then kind of fine tune it as I go. As I go along. So just try this out, see where it is. Every picture is slightly different. It's doing fairly well. There's a lot of texture on these rocks, and when you're dealing with like a Twilight picture, because there's a lot of blue, that could kind of screw you up a little bit when it comes to masking. So that's why I was trying to separate that foreground really well. But for the most part, it's doing a good job. I could shift the edge back a little bit more. I don't want to go too far just because I don't want to have blue come back. See, if I go into the positive, you'll start getting like a little blue from the sky, like a very soft blue. Now I don't want to go too far into like the positive because it'll start bringing back too much of the sky. You can see a little blue soft edge. So that's why I like to keep it in the negative. It's right around there. And I could always paint back more of the foreground that I'm missing. Alright, so this looks pretty decent. And I could fix up these little spots here where there's a little bit of blue and a little bit of the rock missing. So hit OK. Now it made a whole new layer with this layer mask. So this other one, you can either move it to the bottom or get rid of it. I'm just going to delete it. Now make sure you click on the layer itself. Now if you hit the backslash button, you can see the layer mask and what's being affected by it. So if I click on here with my brush, I could paint away or paint back in the sky or the rock, depending what I want. And I want to paint back some of these rocks, so I'm going to switch this to white. Now if this red gets to be too much for your eyes, just hit the backslash button again and you can bring back your sky. So this is a little tedious, but it's well worth it to get the best quality image. You really want to blend these very precisely just to kind of make it look more authentic and a lot more natural. So I like to go in there with a very small brush, close to the hardness should be around 90 or higher, and really take your time to kind of go along these edges. So I'm going to speed this up so you don't have to watch this whole process, but it's going to take me a good, 10 or 15 minutes. Alright guys, so once you have that blended pretty nicely, next thing you want to do is reposition your sky. So I'm going to drag this up. Alright, now I don't want to go too high because I don't want the foreground from this picture to interfere with the foreground that we're replacing it with. So right around here should be good. Now the one thing I don't like is the position of this Milky Way. The core is right at this peak and it's kind of being obstructed. So I think I'm going to bring it to the left a little bit, just so you can kind of see some more of it. And now we have this gap to fill. So what I'm going to do here is duplicate the layer. Now this bottom layer, I'm going to slide that over. That looks pretty good. You can still see a little bit of a line right here. So what I'm going to do now is merge down. Now they are one layer. And there's several different options. I think for this, I'm going to use my healing brush. Increase the size. We'll decrease the sharpness. I'm sorry. We'll increase the size. We'll decrease the hardness. And put it on replace. Now sample an area. Let's go from this side. And just kind of paint away that line. And since we are like basically taking this sky portion and putting it right here, you can see the stars are like the patterns exactly the same. So you might want to also just randomly select a couple areas and kind of just paint the stars just to kind of break up the pattern, just like this. Zoom out and make sure there's definitely no pattern that's recognized. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. The foreground looks nice and natural, and then I have nice fall off light where it goes to black in the background. That's really what you want. And if you don't have that, you could always use your burn tool and kind of just darken this a little bit more, because you just want it to look as natural as possible. You can't have like a really bright mountain back here that's, you know, just looks out of place and just unrealistic. So try and have some really good dark areas in the background here. So let's work on the sky a little bit. So I'm going to select my sky layer, and I have my burn tool selected, and I want the hardness to be 0, and then pick a size. And now I'm just going to burn away. Actually, you know what? Let's make a copy of this sky. In case I go too much, you always want to work from the copy. So now we're going to burn this and really, you know, increase the contrast and kind of pull out some detail in these dust clouds. Now if you go too far, you can just lower the opacity, and that's the great thing about working off of a copy. So I'm going to leave it right there, switch this to dodge, and let's make this highlights. Hardness on 0. And we could dodge the core. Oops, I still have that very high. Make your exposure. I like to keep it around 1 or 2%. You want subtle changes. You don't want things to be too extreme. Again, it's all about authenticity. So try and keep everything as relatively natural as possible. And if we toggle this on and off, you can kind of see the changes. Again, if it's too much, I can always just lower the opacity right around there. That looks pretty good. Now let's dodge some of this foreground too. It's a very flat light. That's the only bad thing about when you're dealing with starlight and twilight, that it could be kind of flat. So we'll try and make some contrast here using our highlight brush, and then we'll burn a little bit as well. Now because they're on their own layer, I'm only affecting the foreground, so even if I go into the sky, it's not going to damage it at all. This is bogging down a little bit because I'm recording. Okay. Let's go to burn. And we can burn some of the shadows in here as well. Alright, so now what I want to do is flatten this layer. I'm going to make another copy. Now I like to mess around sometimes with Nik software, so let's go to Filter, Nik Collection, Color Effects. Okay, so in Color Effects, one of the filters I really like to use is Glamour Glow. So let's select that. And let's increase the saturation. And it just kind of makes it a little dreamy. It also helps blend the two layers together so they look like they are more cohesive and belong with each other. Now, I don't like to go too crazy. I typically keep it around 20 to 30%. And if we hit add another filter, we could play around with either curves, or let's try and do a tonal contrast. Now this helps bring out a lot of detail, but you want to use it sparingly. As you see right off the bat, it's just way too much. So let's bring all these toggles down a little bit, and I'm also going to change this to fine. It's more subtle is what we're going for. You don't want to go super crazy. And now we can lower this saturation and just start playing around with these sliders. So my highlights are going to get affected with this one, midtones and shadows, as you see here. So I'm going to keep the shadows kind of low. It's more this mid-tone area that I really want to affect. Here, I'll go on the extreme side just so you can see. That looks pretty cool. Obviously it's too much, but at least you kind of get an idea of what's being changed. So I'm going to put this around 25, and I'm going to add another filter, and I could do tonal contrast again, but maybe this time I'll add a control point, and I'll just put it right on these rocks here, this tufa, and change this to fine. And we could lower these sliders a little bit. Now let's increase it just a little bit more. Just want to bring out that detail, and that kind of is helping to create more separation, so it kind of is a little more contrasty as well. Okay, I like that. Looks pretty good. Hit OK. Okay, so here is our color effects versus what it was. Now, in my personal opinion, I think the color effects is just a little too much. So what we could do is we could either put a layer mask on here and paint away some of it, or we could lower the opacity and kind of blend it. Or I could also drop it behind this layer and put a layer mask on here and just paint in exactly what I want. Now I think I'm just going to go with option number 2, which is let's lower the opacity and just kind of get a good blend of both layers. So I like that. It's bringing back a little bit more detail in here. If it's maybe it's a little too much, I'll just lower it a little bit more. Around 30%. Alright, I like that. Once you're good, flatten the layer. And we could close this out, hit save. Okay, so now we're back in Lightroom, and we could do further adjustments if we need to, or you might be satisfied with the product that you just created in Photoshop. So let's just mess around a little bit more. Let's switch over to this and do a curves adjustment just a little bit, something along those lines. At this stage, it's pretty much personal preference, and playing around and kind of just experimenting, seeing what you like. You know, playing around with the clarity, maybe your saturation, maybe increasing the exposure a little bit more. But overall, this looks like a nice, well-balanced night photo versus something like this. You see how, you know, exaggerated this is. So you really want to make sure when you're blending two exposures at two different times, that you take in consideration what it should really look like. So with that being said, thank you for watching. It's time to wrap this up, and I hope this really helps you guys out. If there's any questions, please leave them in the comments below. Also, thanks so much for helping me hit over 6,000 subscribers. Please give me that thumbs up, and I will talk to you guys soon. Bye.